Hello everyone. Tonight we're coming to you from the old bear's den of Bigfoot. Tonight's story is a story out of Tennessee, near Gallatin, Tennessee. And the truck driver that I met down there, we were at a receiver, and I had finished unloading and happened to see him, and he waved at me, so I went over and started talking to this gentleman. And after talking to him, I kind of mentioned something. He had asked him if he'd ever seen anything strange. He said, yeah. He'd seen something that he thought was a Bigfoot when he was out hunting the fall a year ago this coming November. He saw this, and he was telling me the story of it, so I'm going to relay that to you and let you know that I talked to this guy and I checked his story out with him, and he had all the... So here's his story. His story starts about an hour before daylight in November of last year. And while he was going to go bow hunting, he was after a certain buck. And he had narrowed it down to that buck being in a certain area, staying in there, not going anywhere. There was does in there, there was food, there was water. So the buck was staying in that area. And he got there about an hour to maybe 45 minutes before daylight, grabbed his tree stand, grabbed his bow, headed into the tree that he had put tape around that he had planned on climbing into. So after he did that, he got his tree stand around the tree, climbed up the tree about 20-25 feet, and sailed in for his morning hunt. Well, he sat in a tree and he'd seen a couple of squirrels and a couple of chipmunks and some birds, but he didn't see any deer. So he climbed into his tree. After he climbed in his tree, didn't see anything, didn't see no deer, so he climbed out about 11 o'clock. Because he put a game cam in there to see when this buck was coming in. Well, this buck was coming in early morning. He said about 7 to 8 o'clock. It was in there. It would be in there anywhere from 7 to 10. And after 10 o'clock, you never saw it again until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So 11 o'clock, he climbs out of his tree, goes to his pickup, eats his lunch, nothing eventful happened. And he goes back to his tree stand about 12:30 to 1 o'clock, gets back in it, climbs back up the tree again, and he's sitting there. And while sitting there, he heard something off to his left, and it was getting close to 2, so he thought it was the buck. And he kept watching off to his left, never saw anything, and then finally it come out and hit the trail that he came in on. And he was glad that he had sprayed, scent killer on his clothes and on his boots and on his tree stand and everything, so he's figuring this buck's going to walk out at any time. Well, it wasn't a buck that walked out. It was an 8 to 9 foot tall Bigfoot that came walking out. He said it was auburn in color. It had hair all over its body. Hair hung long down off its head and its shoulders. And the Bigfoot had a human-type face, but there was something wrong with it. Like maybe it had Down syndrome or something of that nature, because it just looked funny to him. And he's looking at it at 20 yards, so he can pretty well tell what it looks like. Well, after a minute or two, this thing standing there, it turns and walks away from him and walks up the point that's in front of him. So after this Bigfoot walks up the point, he's sitting there for a little longer, and he's still, it's got his mind, said it's like cobwebs filled his mind. He didn't know what to think. So he sits there for probably another half an hour, and he hears something off to the right. Sounds like a deer walking. And he's hoping it's not another one of these things, because he didn't really want to have to deal with, two of them. And, the one had walked off, so he's kind of watching to the right, and he sees the buck. Well, the buck comes walking over, walks right in front of him, and stops. And he had got up, and he shot the deer. And when he shot the deer ran over about 20 yards and piled up just kind of hit the ground and kicked its legs a couple times and laid there still. So he's sure the deer's dead. He climbs out of the tree, takes his stand off the tree, puts it together, carries it and his bow over to the deer laying there, goes over, pokes the deer to make sure it's dead, and then he goes through the process of taking the guts and everything out of the deer. And then he puts a rope around the deer's head, and while he's putting the rope around the buck's head, he hears something coming off the point. Well, he looks up and he sees this Bigfoot walking off the point. And it's the same one that he saw walk up the point no more than an hour and a half ago. Now, I don't know if he said he didn't know if the Bigfoot smelt the blood or smelt the entrails or whatever that, after he got at the deer. So he hooked the deer up and with his rope, put the strap around him and started dragging the deer, making all kinds of noise, going out of the woods with it, carrying his bow stand, his bow, and dragging the deer. At this point, he says he heard the Bigfoot make a noise, like a grunt or something, or maybe a growl, and he heard it coming on down to the path that he was on. He said he heard it stop there at where he gutted the deer. By this time, he's within eyesight of his truck, because he was dragging the deer pretty quick, he said. And he picked up his pace a little more when the Bigfoot made the noise and got over to his truck, slid the deer down right there at the top of the bank, threw his tree stand in the back of the truck, set his bow down, dropped the tailgate, pulled the deer right onto the tailgate, shoved the deer in the bed of the truck, shut his tailgate. He went around, went to put his bow in the passenger side of his pickup, and at that point, he said he heard it coming out the footpath that he just drugged the deer on. So he hurried up, got around there, got in his pickup, and got it started and got out of there. Went straight home, got to the house, showed his wife his deer, took it into the backyard in the pickup, and hung it up in a big oak tree he's got in the back of the house. He tied it up with a pretty heavy rope, hung it in the tree, went back in, and his wife wanted to go to dinner, so him and his wife went to dinner. They went to dinner, got home around, he said, about 10:30, 11 o'clock. They went in, straight to bed. He looked out the window when he was in the bathroom, from the master bathroom in his house, and he could see the deer hanging out in the yard. So he went off to bed, and about 7 a.m. in the morning, he got up, went out to look at his deer, and when he got outside, he said, I opened the door, and my deer wasn't in the tree. He couldn't figure out how the deer got out of the tree. He thought maybe, somebody came and stole it or something. He'd find out, tracks or whatever. And he went out and looked around the tree, and it looked like the rope had been broken instead of being cut or just untied. So he went back in and told his wife. Well, his wife got dressed, and they went out looking around, and they couldn't find anything. They seen blood that was going across the yard to the back fence and they found a little bit of deer hair on the top of the fence. Now his fence, he said, is a 6-foot privacy fence on the back side of his house that goes along 3 sides of his house. So that means that somebody would have had to been below the deer, shoving it up and over the fence, and somebody on the other side of the fence pulling the deer across. So he couldn't figure out what happened or how anybody got out there without him knowing about it, because the privacy fence connects right to the house on both sides. And then he kind of went back to the tree and noticed a set of footprints that were pushed down in the leaves, and they were big footprints. So it looked like a human foot, but they were probably 16 to 18 inches long. And what he couldn't figure out is how a Bigfoot could track him to his house. Now, mind you, it was only 2 miles through the woods to his house. But by the road, it's 10 miles. So he couldn't figure out how the Bigfoot found his house and how he got in the yard and how they got the deer out of there without making any noise. And the only thing he could figure out is the Bigfoot climbed one of the trees on the backyard, jumped across the fence, come over, ripped the deer down, took it to the back fence, threw it across the fence, and maybe one of the legs or the back hip caught on part of the privacy fence and pulled some hair out, and that's how they got it out of there. And he described the look of the Bigfoot to me, and the Bigfoot, he said, looked just like a human face, except its nose was all squashed down, and except for the strange look on its face of, maybe Down syndrome or something, kind of held its mouth kind of funny and so on and so forth. Anyways, he told me a story, and that's his story, and that's the one I'm giving you tonight. And I hope that you like it and enjoy it. And if you have any comments, leave a comment. If you like the channel, subscribe to it, and we'll bring some more stories to you. Y'all have a blessed evening, and we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.